Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're excited to host tonight's event with Daphne Merkin presenting her new book, 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love. She will be talking with Meghan Daum, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Daphne, Meghan, and the publicists who helped make this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. The exact location will depend on what type of device you're using. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat, which is a great way to show your support for the authors and interact with fellow attendees. But if you have a specific question that you would like to have answered by the author, please make sure you post that question in the Q&A module. You can find that by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so make sure you put them there and not the chat. We'll be recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com for shipping or curbside pickup. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. And as a special bonus, we're offering 15% off when you purchase the book this week. We'll be posting the buy link and coupon code in the chat, so please keep an eye out for those. Our interviewer for this evening is Meghan Daum. She is the author of 6 books, most recently, The Problem with Everything, a New York Times notable book. She writes regularly for Medium's Gen magazine and has contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and Vogue, among other publications. Her collection of original essays, The Unspeakable, and Other Subjects of Discussion, won the 2015 Penn Center USA Award for Creative Nonfiction. An opinion columnist for the Los Angeles Times for more than a decade, she was the recipient of a 2015 Guggenheim Fellowship and a 2016 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and is on the adjunct faculty in the MFA writing program at Columbia University School of the Arts. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Daphne Merkin. She is the author previously of the novel Enchantment and won the Edward Lewis Wallen Award for Best Novel on a Jewish Theme, as well as 2 collections of essays and the memoir This Close to Happy. She is a former staff writer for The New Yorker, and her essays frequently appear in The New York Times, Book Forum, The New Republic, Departures, Elle, Travel and Leisure, Tablet, and many other publications. Merkin has taught writing at the 92nd Street Y, Marymount Manhattan College, and Hunter College, and she currently teaches in Columbia University's MFA program. Her new book, 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love, is candid and provocative in its exploration of psychosexual abuse and its boundaries, yet playful and rich in humor, offering a riveting depiction of the erotic lives of women. Daphne is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Meghan and with all of you. Please take it away, Daphne and Meghan.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Katie.
for having us here.
Wait, I'm gonna say a few things. Wait, before Daphne takes that. First of all, congratulations on this incredible novel. And look how many participants we have. If we were in the bookstore, all the seats would be filled. And we would be so relieved right now.
Right.
So thank you all. But I want to start, before we forget, by announcing that today is the publication of the reprint of your first novel, Enchantment. Is that correct? It's just come out from Picador. So congratulations.
Thank you.
That's available for purchase as well too, right? So
yes.
Excellent. So, all right, well, I'm so excited to talk, but why don't we kick it off with just a short reading. I think you're gonna read a couple times and we'll talk in between. So
Sure.
Wanna take it away and then we'll.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to read from, it precedes the prologue, if there is such a thing, and it's just an italicized 2 pages. Okay. In this story, there is no final scene, no decisive change of heart or firm resolve, so much as a furious inner struggle, a struggle that has left no discernible traces, yet has marked me as surely as bruises after a fall. Because there is no end to the hunger for unconditional love and no end to my belief that he was the one to give it to me. I have no stopwatch to measure how long the experience of sexual pleasure, of losing yourself, lasts at any particular time. It could be 10 minutes or 15 or 22, How do you measure the crest of a wave? All I know is that when it vanishes, it leaves in its wake a devouring appetite for more. To this day, I can't forget how he was always touching me in bed, acting as though my skin came as a surprise. You feel so soft, he said, so smooth. Nothing very original in that, I realize, and yet coming from him, I felt it as a lovely succumbing, a weakening of his ordinary resistance. Then there is this. I am a writer, a believer in the powers of art to shape experience so that others might recognize something of themselves in it. Except when it comes to my own life, it appears. I have decided to tell this story now, after all these years, as a way of forcing it to the finish line. I am still confused about how I got to that place to begin with, and how I got out without going mad, howling like a wolf. I think it had something to do, despite all evidence to the contrary, with some intact shred of a life force. I willed him out of my life in order to pursue a more sane existence, one that would include a husband and children, a daughter I would bring up to feel full in herself, without vast absences or ravaging needs. But it was just that, an effort of will rather than a natural ending, only a sense that if I wanted to survive, I would have to move on. Meanwhile, the efficient little clock on my desk keeps marking the passage of time. If you pick up this clock, a practically weightless traveling clock with white hour and minute hands and a yellow second hand, and hold it close to your ear, you can hear a faint, even tick. So many days, months, and years have intervened, not to mention a marriage, the daughter I wished for, and another child on the way. You'd think he'd have no place in my thoughts anymore. And for periods of time, he doesn't, only to alight on my nerve endings once again. It has to do, I imagine, with the tedium, the worn routines that are an inescapable part of domestic life. Some habit of my husband's that I have tired of, such as the way he blinks his eyes rapidly when someone disagrees with him, or the way my daughter puts up an argument about something perfectly reasonable, like getting into her pajamas before bedtime. Suddenly a space opens up, a wedge of restlessness mixed with longing, and Howard Rose walks back in.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Oh, Howard Rose. All right. Well, before we get to him, you have said it took you 30 years to write this novel. I mean, I think we should say, not that we need to say, you published several other books and written major pieces and done a lot over that time. So we needn't think you were just sitting there at your keyboard for 3 decades.
Right.
But when you say that you've been working on it for 30 years, what does that mean? Does that mean you've been gestating it, that you've been thinking about it, or were you actually like writing pages all these decades?
Right. When I say that it took, it's been going on for 30 years, I partly mean I started it once, got very, very far in it, had a book contract. It was called at that time The Discovery of Sex, which I decided was too frontal a title eventually. And then I pulled it back from the publisher because I felt it was, I guess I would say, especially given my background, which is that I come from a modern Jewish Orthodox family, which is still observant, except for me, that I felt somehow the community, of which I was not a real part, but my family was, would look horrified on as the character whom they would no doubt interchange with me, as most people do, especially I think with first person. Yeah. Even sophisticated writers sort of say, oh, that's really the writer. So less sophisticated readers. So I stopped at the point where Judith Rose crawls across the floor. Judith Stone.
It's Stone.
Now I have her married. Judith Stone crawls across the floor at the dictum of Howard Rose. But it was a very different book. It was written without a framing device. So over the years, I kept coming back to it. I could never leave it because the subject interested me. But I would come back and try what I thought of as a French approach. I think I'd been reading Annie Ernaux, and I thought, okay, write it more dryly, not so impassioned. And then I tried different first, third person. I tried a completely different way of telling the whole story. And then finally, truthfully, I sold it to other publishers, never getting it done, paying back many book contracts. And finally, I had a 4-book contract with FSG. One of them was this novel in the making, and I felt too embarrassed not to finish it.
That's a great motivator. That's
great motivator. So yes. So I went back and decided to tell. The main change I think I made was to tell it in flashback. So the woman at the center of it was out of it already. Because I couldn't figure out, how do you get out of this kind of relationship, an obsessive one, without killing yourself like Anna Karenina, or sort of going nuts like the end of 9.5 Weeks. So I kept thinking, how do you get out of these relationships? But I had my own problems in getting out of these relationships. So I kept looking for that device.
Yeah, I want to talk about some of the literary techniques in a bit, but before we do that, so tell us about this relationship between Judith Stone and Howard Rose. I mean, you talk about sadomasochism. It sounds like you had a sadomasochistic relationship to the book all these years. I mean, maybe there was some parallel track going on, but you know, it
runs throughout my life.
Yeah. Okay. So it seems to me that, like, a lot of the, I don't know if sadomasochism is the
right.
term exactly, and I want to talk about that, but a lot of that happened out of the bedroom in the book.
True.
The way he keeps her at arm's length, demands her attention, and then refuses it. So just tell us about this relationship and how it, and the book itself, the story itself, because the relationship is the story.
Well, for one thing, I meant it to be, I think many women, especially when they're younger, go through what I think of as a series of bad taste in men. Like, the man who excites them isn't necessarily the man who is good to them or for them. So in some ways, this was supposed to be about a man who wasn't good for the main character, who didn't have her interest at heart. But he also represented, for her, because she's sexually not that experienced, the erotic principle, even though the whole book does not take place in bed, thank goodness. I think without that principle, he wouldn't have held her. Just simply kind of being cold to her. And then once in a while, he was, I think that intermittent reinforcement thing attaches her a lot to him. And he is quite, if tender is too strong, but he's giving in bed. That's where she gets the feeling that she's sort of fused with him, which is a longing not everyone has. Not everyone feels so alone in the world that they need to be actually, with a connective tissue to someone else. But I think this narrator did. It was also important to me to give her work that meant something to her. I remember years ago, I worked in book publishing, from where I got the experience, and the publisher, Bill Yovanovitch, said to me, women always leave work out of their novels. I don't think it's so true now.
Yeah.
But a certain kind of novel, I think in the 50s and 60s, even 70s, the woman did something like worked as an actress. I'm thinking of Margaret Drabble. who I wrote a profile of, it wasn't ever so clear what her narrators did. Or another novel I love called The Pumpkin Eater by Penelope Mortimer. In real life, Penelope Mortimer was a very successful writer. In her novel, she basically shops at Harrods, cries at Harrods, and doesn't do much. So it was important to me, without making her, you know, the career was everything, because obviously it wasn't, that it was important to her.
And she's what, 20, how old is she, 28?
She's worried that she's about to turn 30.
And he is in his 40s, right?
Yes, early 40s.
Okay. And this takes place in the 1990s.
Yes.
The narrator, right. So I thought that was an interesting choice. I often think to myself, you don't do a lot of social media, right? Or at all. So
I'm starting to force myself. Yeah.
Was part of the choice to set it in the past so that you wouldn't have to contend with all the contemporary devices and accoutrements, and
yeah,
because I often think, oh my gosh, how could I write a novel set now, because I'm not on Instagram, and
right.
It would be like the sun is missing from the picture or something.
That's definitely part of the reason. There were also aspects of the 90s that I was nostalgic for phone booths, and maybe the world is a little less speeded up, but certainly it was important to me to sort of set it enough. I mean, in a way, Me Too was hovering in the back of my mind, because while I was actually finally writing it, Me Too began with a bang, if I may say so, and I didn't want it to enter. So I kept it enough away that 10 years later, when she's looking back, it's still pre that moment.
So you say about him, Howard Rose, was someone I had tried to win over long ago and had succeeded for a while, only to fail in the end. You say he was my mother with bits and pieces of my father thrown in. Do you see that as a sort of template relationship, the kind of thing that everyone has to go through once, hopefully just once, the sort of obviously unhealthy but nonetheless extremely compelling relationship that mirrors some of the complications of your relationships with your parents, or shards of that mirror somehow? Like, can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of that?
Right. I do actually think that people, even later on, in later relationships, but I am, what's the word? Not adamantly, I do believe in large parts of the psychoanalytic approach to life. Many parts I don't. I think people work out some of what was problematic in their growing up with romantic choices. So if, in this case, I think, since I wrote it, Judith Stone has a sort of negligible, a childhood where there is negligible interest in her. The mother's sort of cool and removed. The father is busy in his workshop and prefers her sister. So she never feels like the center of anyone's love. I don't know if she feels much love anyway. And that, I think, is something that she mistakes Howard Rose's attention for a form of overheated love. And I think it was important to me to sort of convey that I don't know if I really think people get out of neurotic, although that seems too mild, pathological relationships simply by having an aha moment one day and thinking, oh, he's a jerk.
The spell is broken. Yeah.
Right. I don't think spells are broken that way. I think ultimately women and men make decisions that are sometimes go against their, what they feel, their heart, their passions, and just decide this is not where I want to be. Or in her case, I think she felt she'd end up in pieces.
Well,
that
I don't see how they could continue. I mean,
right.
It wasn't, it's so much of it was projection, as so many relationships are, especially when they sort of can't develop beyond a certain point. I mean, you talk about how you write, and I want you to read a little bit more, but you say in these kinds of stories, the man in question is never interesting. And
right.
you talk about how he's an object of interest that no one really found that interesting. And
right.
that is a very interesting idea.
Right. Right. That's actually where I was going to read a little.
Yeah. Can you read a little more for us?
I'll read just from here. In these kinds of love-struck stories, the man in question is never really interesting. No one found Howard Rose interesting. No one, that is, but me. I'm not sure I found him interesting either, not in any clear sense, so much as a reminder of where I emotionally began and would always remain, no matter how hard I tried to move away. Dazzled by intermittency, by the light beaming on and then off, a glimpse of absolute happiness followed by nothing but the lonely darkness. The allure of remoteness, affection edged in ice, and always on the verge of melting away, of disappearing entirely, suggesting a greater possibility of being converted into love than all the tender kisses in the world. To me, then, he was someone I had tried to win over long ago, and had succeeded for a while only to fail in the end, or more exactly, only to realize that what I longed for would eventually leave me in tatters. He was my mother, I suppose, with bits and pieces of my father thrown in, but to what extent that clarifies matters is anyone's guess. How everything conspires to keep us in the dark about ourselves. And then I'm just going to go. If I write all this down, put it into the third person, and pretend it happened to someone else, someone I happen to know intimately, will it change anything? Redeem what seems irredeemable by putting a fictional gloss on it? Will it transform these doings from one woman's plight into something larger, a case history with application to others? To you, the reader, for instance, who, I might add, wants to read a story, even one promising some juicy sex, if it isn't about you too, like going into a store ready to spend money, only to be peered at by some frosty saleswoman and told, sorry, we have nothing in your size. How maddening. You open a book when you could, after all, be doing so many other things, catching up on your email, watching TV, skimming a magazine, reading a different book, making love, going to a yoga or exercise class, masturbating, cutting onions, eating, drinking, shopping, so many other things, expecting exactly that, to find something in your size. So I hereby give you Judith Stone, a woman with an 8 coursing through her, who is me, who is you, or might very well be you. And then I'll just, who knows finally by what process an obsession begins to take hold, begins by stealth to fill in a gaping hole you didn't even know was there. It seems to me now, all these years later, that I wanted him forever, almost within minutes of meeting him. But why? The randomness of it still gnaws at me. I suppose those who study such processes would point to the crackle of human electricity, a potent pheromone, or a clamor starting up in one's limbic system, sending out neurons of desire. I myself believe none of it. Better you should ask, why is the sky blue?
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody to start submitting your questions on the chat. Don't forget, we'll start taking them in about 10 or 15 minutes or so. So Daphne, over the 30 years that you were writing this book, the contours of feminism shifted many times, to put it mildly. I wonder, like, as I was reading, I found myself wondering how Judith Stone might have interpreted this experience if she was having it in 2020 as opposed to 1995 or whenever
Right.
it was. Do you
No, it's an interesting question. I think in 2020 she wouldn't have admitted to this experience because it goes against the current grain. Certainly this is not about consent. I'm not sure I believe that fashions in women, even via feminism, and fashions in culture change so much about basic human desire. I mean, not everyone has a desire to be dominated, to be taken away from herself. In some ways, I think Judith Stone is it's funny, I'm interrupting to say I had another conversation where the interlocutor said to me, do you consider yourself a feminist? And then she said, well, I think you're a feminist of one, because I'm a natural puller away from groups of any sort. I think the one way, or many ways, but one striking way, I think I do not identify with the character is I don't believe in my life, whatever my relationships were, that I ever looked for affirmation in quite this way from men.
Mm.
That I had a sort of preconceived identity. I think I looked for being desired, being valued, but I don't think the affirmation part, and I think that's ostensibly what's changed today, that women less look for affirmation from men. Whether I truly believe it's changed is another question.
Oh, wait, say more about that. So the conventional wisdom is that has changed, or that's just sort of the line you have to, that's the line you have to toe, or, but it hasn't really changed? I'm curious.
It's something I think about a lot. I mean, I have a daughter who's 30, and I look at her friends, and they're all achieved, to use that word, and pursuing medical careers or law school careers, but I still get the sense, not that it's secondary to the man in their life, but it wouldn't work without a man. In their instance, it's all men, without a man emotionally underwriting it, if that makes any sense. But then again, I'm sure there are younger women, certainly than me, for whom this is all alien, that men come and go, and except that, I mean, society in the end is conventional. You have to want to step outside society and say, I'm going to live my own way, which not everyone is up to doing.
Well, and human need and human desire is pretty static over the course of civilization, right? And human evolution. So, but I want to think about this, because is it so much that they need the emotional support, otherwise the other stuff wouldn't work? Or is it just that everybody needs this sort of balance? And is balance in and of itself a fallacy? I mean, that's a tyranny in a way.
Right. I don't think when I said emotional underwriting, I meant support. I'm not sure how much women need the support of men, but I think a woman alone, if you're straight, becomes an issue. I have a very talented younger friend. She just turned 35. She's in many ways would be considered a beauty. She writes for TV. She's near frantic. I hope she's not watching. That she, unlike her friends, has not yet married. And if she wants a child, there's that issue. Her eggs, freezing her eggs. I think what am I trying to say? The template of marriage hasn't moved off so heavily, at least in this country. If you're straight, your choice is a man. And that's really my thoughts, that I don't know. For the younger generation, for the famous millennials, do they completely not define themselves through men? I don't get that sense at all. The little I've looked, I must say, in these last weeks at Instagram, I get the sense a lot of it is about posturing, looking attractive. Some women I know, I mean, I don't know them, I was shown their sites. They're what's the word, explicitly sexual. So I don't think women have receded completely from that.
Do you think it's harder to find men that offer the sort of suite of, I don't want to say, you know, is it harder to find men now who will satisfy the needs and desires of women? Do you find that there is a sort of, I don't want to say shortage, but, you know, you read all these things about women are, you know, achieving beyond men in a lot of ways. The educational attainment is higher. Frankly, they don't have to have men to have families. That's a huge difference. Not that it's ideal, but, you know, a woman who really wants to have a child can do it by herself. A man who wants to have a child really cannot, unless
that is.
Yeah. So how does that change the dynamics of mating and partnering?
Well, I don't know if you remember, about a year ago, there was an article in the Atlantic, or maybe less, about how little sex women are having.
Young women, yeah, millennials, right? Yeah.
Close to 80-year-olds. I think it's a big decision to have a child, for a woman to decide to have a child on her own. As far as I have seen, that usually happens later, when you sort of give up on the scenario of you and a man and a horizon and so I've seen that more in women in their 40s. Decide. I don't know how many women in their 30s take that option, but I think you're right. It's changed in some ways, and then again, in some ways not, as we've done. The necessity of men. You know, I think a book came out called Are Men Necessary?
Yeah, Maureen Dowd. It was Maureen Dowd.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think she answered the question. That was by the time you got to the end. I read it very eagerly, waiting to get to the answer.
Right. So I think in a way, I also wonder how much men feel that. I mean, they are the other creature in the room. They're not invulnerable. I don't know whether the kind of dominant need that women needed men to have children gave men an upper hand. What was that ancient, my mother never used it because she was from Germany and didn't know these American idioms, but something like, if you give the milk, why would he pay?
Why buy the cow if you can get the milk for free?
I don't know, that expression fascinated me. Not that I followed it.
It's hard to follow. It still doesn't, it's not the smoothest idiom. It takes a couple leaps of logic.
It does. But I think what you asked, there are changes. I must say, this is my view, and I think there's always been a shortage of men for specific type of women. Women who are kind of people unto themselves, not the other half of a couple. I think there aren't that men. I think there are men who are still uncomfortable with that. There certainly were, and I think some men still are. I don't know how many feminist men actually exist.
Well, they say they are, yes, though.
Yeah, which is
hashtag themselves as feminists.
Right.
So we're going to take some questions in a minute, but I want to talk about this literary device that you use throughout the book, where the narrator dips in and out of the story. So right. It's kind of I'm reminded a little bit of the Nathan Zuckerman point of view in many of Philip Roth's novels. Right. Nabokov's talked about the shifting agent, or the sort of author's representative. Right. But usually this is like an outside person.
Not the
in your case, the narrator is the older version of Judith. So was that something that you came up with at some point? Was that like in the 20th year mark, or no. How did it take you to get to that?
Right. She's also supposed to actually be the third, like this Judith, the older, Judith the younger, and that's this somehow slightly disembodied narrator, which I somewhat thought of as the essayistic part of me that wanted to be in the book. I will say I began with that when I first stopped writing it. Over the years, I kept taking it in, taking it out, cutting how much I wanted to do. Had conflicts about that. In a way, it stopped the story, which I partly, maybe in some sadomasochistic, sadistic way, wanted to do. But I also was a former graduate student who had imbibed a lot of deconstructionism. And one phrase that stayed with me was perforating the text. I loved that phrase. And this for me was perforating the text, like with a nod to a reader who wanted a plot, what happens next, and also to a reader who had thought about fiction, how does it work today, those kind of thoughts. So I tried to write to both those kind of readers.
I also had a question. You make a move that reminded me of something that a lot of screenwriters kind of keep in mind. You set up in the beginning, toward the beginning, there's a catalyst, and I think it's okay to give this away. Her psychiatrist, she loses her psychiatrist abruptly. Let's just put it that way. Right. Now, did you do that because you wanted to avoid like the question of why isn't she going to her shrink, throughout this experience and having some sense talked into her? Or was it like the shrink represented a paternal figure? She talks about him as the ultimate unrequited love object. Was that what it is? So yeah, what went into that particular decision?
Yeah. It sort of came organically. Partly I am the beneficiary, if that's what it is, of many years of being shrunk. I once wrote a piece for the Times Magazine about my 40 years in therapy. And I think I began saying 40 years, all that money, all that unrequited love. Not that I had unrequited love for every therapist I think for her, it was a way of sort of suggesting some of her difficulties without saying she felt no one loved her, without being so, what's the word? Not discursive, when you explain, expository about what was wrong with her, that some of it came through the shrink, and that the loss of the shrink, who, as you say, she might have been seeing throughout the novel, and he would have advised her, can't you see who Howard Rose is? That she's left to her own, to her own devices. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to open these chat questions. The first person says this is really more a comment than a question. There always has to be that person.
Right.
No, I'm kidding. Okay. Oh, the first question is from David Shields. Hi, David. He says, hi, Daphne and Meghan. I love the book. I especially love its structure, its complex play of quasi-memoir and quasi-novel. It's mirrors upon mirrors. Was it all written at the same time?
No, emphatically not. It was, as I discussed, it was written over a very long period of time.
Right.
It was always there. I mean, before autofiction, a term I think is completely unnecessary, we used to just say autobiographical fiction. Now it's before some of that, I guess it has a piece of metafiction, and that is the graduate student literary critic in me.
Okay, and actually David followed up his question. He said, you already answered this question. Bear with me, I've never done this before. He says, I see this book as, of course, totally connected to Enchantment and your essay on spanking. The book has a meta quality of being legible for the reader only if we have read those other things. On a meta level, perhaps. How exactly did Annie Arnaud help you figure out this book?
But those are such different issues.
I know. I don't know. Okay, we can.
David, those are too many questions.
Okay.
I think it does link, as David's suggesting, but I think you don't need to either have read Enchantment or the essay that has haunted me ever since I wrote it, which is this essay about erotic spanking. I don't think you need to. I think it would inform what you're reading if you're that kind of attentive reader. And Annie Arnaud wrote a book called Simple Passion that I remember being fascinated by and wrote a long essay about for the New Yorker. I put it together with The Bridges of Madison County by Robert Waller, or whatever his name was. And I was thinking how different they were. In Annie Arnaud, the love affair is not even there. It's either post or anticipatory. So I liked the distillation of the romance, as opposed to he saw her, he fell in love, he liked the way she tied her apron strings or something. So she had that effect on me, leaving out things.
Okay, Sarah Neer gets right to the question many people are probably asking themselves. The poking at Judith being you, Daphne, is tantalizing. Answer us, is she you? Was there a Mr. Rose in your life? And why not write your story if so?
What was the first word? The poking?
Well, the poking it, you're kind of teasing us that
right.
You, it's not you. It's
right.
What she means.
Howard Rose is a composite, for sure, of at least 3 men who each had different bad attributes. I think Judith Stone, I keep wanting to say Rose, to have her married off happily, unhappily. I think Judith Stone is parts of me. And I kind of want to play with that in the book. I mean, people have many selves, and she is one of my selves. At the risk of sounding psychotic, she doesn't represent all of me, but she represents certainly a side of me that was very strong in the past. I hope it's enough of an answer, Sarah.
Okay, there are 2 questions that are sort of connected from 2 different people, so I'll combine them. Joan Ullman asks, do you view this as a happy or a sad story? And Deb Garrison asks, do you feel like novels about love and desire have to be tragic? It feels like this book tries to embrace that, but also to argue for sexual happiness, if for no other type.
It's funny, in writing classes, I always quote this French writer who I don't think I've read other than this quote, whose name is Henri de Montherlant. He wrote The Girls, a book called The Girls. But his quote is, happiness writes white, that it doesn't show up on the page. I would say that I tend to the dark. So it might be hard for me to envision a very happy love affair. I do think, sort of as Deb Garrison brought up, that in the end, the novel is not meant to be wholly sad. She does find her way out. She does make a life of sorts, even if she questions, is this normal looking life really the life she wants? But I think it's a mixture of sad, maybe bittersweet is as close as I can get to happy. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dragana, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce your last name, but I know your name, so you feel familiar to me. So Dragana asks, what is your outlook on courtship and romance for the generation of young women of Gen Z? They have to contend with the fakery of not only bachelor, bachelorette, but Instagram, Snapchat, sexting, etc., being told simultaneously that they own their sexuality and how oppressed they are. So confusing. It was hard enough for me, age 50, but no idea how they do it now. Yeah.
I would pretty much say, I agree. I look on and think, I don't envy their youth in that regard. I think it has become, it's almost like people have avatars of themselves. There's the self that's put out. I think social media, in the end, has drastically changed both I think there is no courtship at this point.
None? None?
Well, if courtship means what leads up to romance.
Well, sometimes it comes after sex.
True.
It's almost like
True.
The sex is like, the coffee date, what the coffee date used to be. And then they decide, I'm not even being sarcastic.
I understand, I agree.
And then it's almost like for efficiency's sake or something, like, are we compatible on a sexual level? And then we'll take it, see if this is going to go anywhere.
Yeah, right. But I think, I'm looking on from my vast distance. My sense is that even post the first sexual encounter, men aren't, I think you have to be slightly trained in courtship. Like, this is what you do next. You send flowers, you write, can you write, I guess you can write an impassioned email saying, that's possible. But I think partly the world of porn, which is so accessible on the internet, and I keep hearing stories, I don't know if they're all, that people come to me with the negative stories in their life, but a friend of mine who's in her early 50 ended up getting divorced, I think two friends of mine, because their husbands looked endlessly at porn. They got divorced. So I think in a way, there's a certain lack of insularity. You need a certain insularity about the couple to court, and that doesn't exist so much, I think.
That's interesting. So there's always a third woman. There's always another woman in the room.
Right.
Eric Rasmussen says, hi, Daphne.
Hi.
I love that reading this novel provides the pleasures of reading a novel and of taking a philosophical journey. You raised the question in the excerpt you read about whether or not one can, quote, redeem what seems irredeemable by putting a fictional gloss on it. As a writer who has so skillfully addressed issues of sadomasochism in both nonfiction and fiction, how do you answer the question? Does the fictional gloss accomplish a universality that you feel nonfiction cannot? If so, why do you think that is?
I guess I didn't totally understand. Is the referent that the subject is sadomasochism, or just in general? Do I think fiction can make experience more general? I'm sorry, I didn't totally get it.
He's so frustrated. Let's see. As a writer who has so skillfully addressed issues, does the fictional gloss accomplish a universality that you feel nonfiction cannot? Okay, so you have more large canvas, psychological canvas, perhaps.
Well, I think as a writer of personal essays, which you also are and are great at, you could achieve a universality or a collective consciousness response in personal essays. I mean, I don't think, you know, journalism at its most conventional invites much, you know, you read, and I think people partly read, obviously, to find out themselves in other people, the so-called famous other. And I think, having recently read a novel that I thought did that better than anything I'd read in a long time, it's called A Burning. In some ways, fiction allows the reader in a little more, if it's done well, I would say.
I'm going to circle back to the questions in a second, but you know, I was going to ask you, the book has been really well received, very positively received, very positive, favorable reviews. Were you surprised by that? Were you worried about the way that the book would be received, given the context of Me Too and
yes,
you know, social media knee-jerk reactionism?
Well, right. I was going to just say, Megan, that for all I know, social media hates it. I have no idea. I believe
I haven't seen anything. I have seen nothing on social media.
Maybe it doesn't exist on social media. I was going to say that if social media had existed when I wrote, I would not have written half of what I wrote. Partly because I find, I'm sure I'm not the only one, that social media must have its pluses as a source of news, although I don't know if you need it for that, but a lot of it is vituperative and exists partly for that. So as my friends know, I was wholly anxious about what kind of reviews it would get, that it would be seen as, and it didn't get so many reviews yet, so I'm sure very negative ones are still to come, that it would be seen as, you know, retrogressive, horribly politically incorrect, embracing an old-fashioned notion of men and women. So when someone called me the day the Times review came out, which was the publication day, it was 8 o'clock in the morning, which I'm usually getting to my best sleep. And she said, "You got a rave." And what I said was, I did not. Because I was so sure that, you know, that it would be criticized, even taken apart limb by, by, you know, by someone who just didn't accept this as a scenario. So that did surprise me.
Was part of your anxiety a result of the way your New York Times piece about Me Too was received? You wrote a great piece. Was it in 2018? 2000, I can't remember, was it? Yeah. You know, where you talk about this kind of cognitive dissonance between what women were expressing publicly versus privately. And did you anticipate the sort of reaction that you got at that time? And how did you feel about what came at you?
Once again, since I am happily not on social media, I took my daughter to tell me, you should see how you're being attacked. And then I went and looked.
Daughter, yes, that's what they're there for.
Right, that's partly what they're there for. And then I did go and look and was astonished at the lengths. Like some guy wrote, well, I met her 10 years ago at a party in East Hampton. I don't think I've ever in my life been at a party in East Hampton. And she was already expressing these views. So I thought some of the stuff was simply made up. Again, I don't want to sound completely anti-social media, which I am. I think it encourages groupthink. And if you go against, I mean, I knew if I wrote this Me Too piece, just as I knew when I wrote the piece we talked about on Sunyi Previn, Woody Allen's wife, there were friends who said to me about both pieces, do not write this. You will be, your reputation will be tarnished forever, which perhaps it's been. But the contrarian in me, which is sometimes too automatic, reflexive, wants to look at the other side.
You know, I was really, I wrote about the way your column was received in my book. And I was really interested in the way that a lot of millennial sort of culture critic types were dismissing your opinion as if it didn't matter because like you were so old. I mean, one of the headlines was, I think somebody said, well, Merkin's op-ed might as well have been titled Boomer Uncomfortable with Change. You know,
Right.
That was before the okay boomer meme. But, you know, I was really struck by that reception because it occurred to me that there have been such dramatic shifts just between, you know, you're a boomer, I'm Gen X, the gulf between somebody, a Gen Xer and a millennial is so radical that it's almost like they don't see us as the same species. Like I'm just really quickly, like I have to say that I'm going to quote from my own book where I talk about you just really briefly. I say, I've never met Merkin, but given her age relative to mine, she was right in the sweet spot of the kind of writer that I looked up to when I was very young. At 25, I not only wanted to know people like Daphne Merkin, I wanted to be them. There were hundreds of writers and artists in my imaginative orbit, some of them over 50 or even possibly 60, whom I felt this way about. I knew none of them, but I wanted to be all of them. And then I talk about how something was different back then. We occupied the same universe. We breathed the same air. We were using phone booths. We had the same sort of mechanisms around us. And I think that on some level, it's hard for women even like 7 years younger than me to relate to what we're saying. And I think it's really sad. There's a sort of lack of mentorship sometimes. I mean, I didn't know you, but you represented something to me that I wanted to be, and I wanted to learn from you and just listen. And like, my job was just to like read you and think about it. And that sort of, doesn't happen as much anymore.
No, I partly think in my critical way, there's a certain fetishization of being young that didn't exist so much. If you're young, everyone else is dopey and doesn't get you. And, you know, we talk about many isms. I think ageism afflicts millennials a lot. And somehow that like they're brand new, there's never been anyone like them. People who preceded them are just old geezers. I know when I was young, in my 20s, I looked up incredibly to this generation of, you know, like Diana Trilling. There were many others. I was involved with Partisan Review in its moribund era, which was a long era, and was certainly the youngest member of the editorial board by at least 30 or 40 years. But I didn't feel, oh, they have nothing to say. Yeah.
You feel how lucky to be in that room.
Yeah.
What a privilege. Suzanne Scanlon says, I also wanted to be Daphne Merkin. So there you go. All right, we have to wrap it up, but my last question, somebody asked a question that was very similar to what was going to be my last question. I'm trying to find it now. when you finished writing this book that you thought about for so many years, did you feel a sense of liberation, accomplishment, relief? Yeah, I was gonna say, how does it feel to have this out in the world after 30 years? Has a great weight lifted?
I always have a great weight, but yes, I felt that I had put something to bed that I had circled for so long. So in that way, it felt like a relief and an accomplishment of sorts.
And what are you hoping that, what would be like the ideal reader, what would be the ideal thing for your ideal reader to take away from it?
I don't want to sound like a fortune cookie, but I partly think the ideal reader would take away that conflict is written into humans, that the inner and outer self don't always match, and that is partly problematic and partly fascinating. And the attempt to bring them together is something I think we all battle with our whole lives, to bring those selves together.
Well said. Well, congratulations. Daphne, thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan.
Everybody, thanks Greenlight. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. One of my favorite stores, but thank you for hosting us.
Thank you very much.
Questions and
Megan, you should mention your own podcast.
Oh, I'm launching my own podcast where I'm going to be having these sorts of fascinating conversations with fascinating people. So, but called The Unspeakable. But this is your evening. We can, you haven't heard the last about that. So, but thank you so much, everybody. Thanks. And thank you.
Greenlight.
Thank you both so much for that wonderful discussion. And thanks to you all for coming. If you missed any of tonight's event, or if you just want to watch it again, the recording may be posted on our website and other channels. Look out for it on our YouTube specifically. And don't forget to purchase your copy of 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love at greenlightbookstore.com. And if you purchase them the next week, use that code UNCONDITIONAL for 15% off the book. So thanks so much for joining us, and thanks so much to you both again. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.